Hi all, my name is Carmel Salhi. I'm an associate professor at Northeastern University in Boston. I want to begin by saying a few words about my position in relationship to this work as context for my talk. As a professor at Northeastern University, a large portion of my work deals with refugee and immigrant health. Uh, I teach undergraduate and graduate courses about theories of systemic inequity and discrimination in relation to global health. My research focuses on understanding the mental health impacts of immigration and resettlement as ongoing processes, and how that's different than treating immigration as a distinct status. I'm also personally a Palestinian refugee and grew up in Dearborn, Michigan. I think I saw some Michigan and even Dearborn representation in the chat, so shout out to my folks. Dearborn is a town which is home to the largest concentration of Arab Americans in the US, and where the Ford Motor Company employs more than half the adult population. And finally, both my parents were lifelong public school teachers across both the Detroit and Dearborn public school systems. So these are the professional, academic, and personal perspectives that I bring to thinking about culture, well-being, and immigration. In my talk, I'd like to provide examples of approaches a teacher might take when working with students from a diversity of backgrounds and life circumstances related to immigration. I'd add that part of what we'll consider is understanding how students and their families interact with a variety of different institutions and agencies that are part of the immigration process. These include institutions we might not typically think of as related to the immigration process, like things like social welfare, employment, and obviously various parts of the education system. The variety of all these experiences raise a lot of considerations for teachers, like how can you prepare for individual challenges students might have? How can you integrate and welcome students with different experiences into your classroom? And how can you balance the demands of teaching to a whole class while being considerate of students' individuality? It's at this point that I want to acknowledge that most, if not everyone in the audience, already has a tremendous amount of experience working with people from different backgrounds. And with that in mind, my goal is to provide a broad overview of 3 structured approaches that can be applied to classroom and other educational settings. I'll begin with an overview of the refugee resettlement process, which will be the basis for discussing these approaches, trying not to repeat too much of what Dr. Crawford-Rossi already went over. And each of the 3 approaches that I'll talk about has specific things they'll emphasize, and we'll talk about the benefits and challenges of each of those. The first approach, called cultural competency, focuses on trying to learn generalized knowledge about groups of people. Cultural competency has been a common approach for a long time, but has some important shortcomings that has led people to adjust it or develop new approaches. One adaptation of cultural competency has been to focus on learning about people's backgrounds directly from those students and their families, an approach called cultural humility. A different and relatively more recent approach has been to focus on understanding how US society, emphasizing specific institutions, agencies, and policies, shape people's experiences. This last approach is called structural competency. Each of these approaches has strengths and blind spots, and in practice, you'll likely want to use each of them depending on your needs. So I'll be grounding my description of cultural competency, cultural humility, and structural competency in the general process of refugee resettlement in the US. I'll briefly describe this here, but want to note that this is a high-level overview of a common but not a universal trajectory. Dr. Crawford-Rossi already provided a thoughtful and more detailed explanation of the pre-resettlement process in particular. So in each year, the US federal government sets a maximum number of refugees who are allowed to enter from any given country or region. Refugees from those countries apply for resettlement to the US through the US Refugee Admissions Program, usually with the assistance of international organizations like UNHCR or the International Organization of Migration. If their application moves forward, decisions about where to resettle refugees are guided by agreements between federal and state governments, as well as between state governments and local agencies. One result of this process is that refugees from one country are often resettled into specific states and specific areas within a state. So one of the goals of this approach of locating resettlement is to have people from the same country in close vicinity to each other so as to build community. As a teacher, a part of how you might experience this process is by seeing new students from a specific country or region in a relatively short period of time. As a result, one reasonable starting point to consider might be to try to learn about the country students are coming from. This can include things like the languages that are spoken there, different customs around things like social interactions and food, the political situation, and even something like the weather and how it compares to one's own community. This approach is called cultural competency because the focus is on trying to learn about the background of a larger refugee population through independent study. It relies on trying to understand broadly generalizable characteristics about cultures and national backgrounds, with the goal of being prepared for respectful interactions. A common example of what this might look like is in resources called refugee backgrounders, which are short documents that summarize facts about a country and its people. These are often provided by refugee resettlement agencies in order to support surrounding communities in welcoming newly resettled refugees. You may already see some of the challenges that come up with solely relying on a cultural competency approach. When someone writes about and tries to summarize what is and is not important about an entire country, or even groups within a country, authors will have to rely on generalizations. These generalizations, in practice, might not overlap with or could even contradict students' experiences. Any resource from the point of view of a specific author may or may not represent the experiences of one's students. In addition to the danger of generalizations, another main critique of cultural competency is that the end goal, being competent about all the important characteristics of other people or other countries, may not be realistic. Even with very detailed resources and dedicated study, it can take a lifetime to be truly competent about another country or groups of people. So while cultural competency has provided some really important strategies as a potential starting point to learn about people's backgrounds, it also has these important shortcomings that make it difficult or problematic to use on its own. As an alternative, one might consider then trying to gain some basic knowledge about a country, but instead of relying on that completely, you go to one's students or to understand their specific experience. You might try to learn about what it was like for them to migrate to the US, what kinds of experiences they had in their old community, and what's different about their old school versus where they are now. You might also ask similar questions to your students' caregivers, who can give you a higher level perspective. That might be especially important for younger students in particular. This can include things like family history, economic circumstances, and broader social relationships. This approach is often referred to as cultural humility because you're placing students or their caregivers as the experts of their own experience, rather than yourself. Part of a cultural humility approach is also evaluating one's own perspective and background to better understand how it affects your relationship dynamics, like our own cultures and assumptions, as well as the power dynamics in the student-teacher relationship. Cultural humility, the development of cultural humility, was driven in large part as an effort to correct the problem of generalizations that arose out of relying on cultural competency. However, it also has its own concerns about placing the responsibilities and expectations of expertise on students and caregivers and their caregivers. Students might not have the capacity to give you certain kinds of information or perspective, especially when it comes to broader circumstances. Caregivers might not feel comfortable being in that position, especially given the vulnerability involved in the resettlement process. And in addition, while it's almost always helpful to learn about a student and their family's experience, it's important to not assume and to keep in mind that these may not translate over to other students and other families. As a result, cultural humility becomes more important in providing perspective about how one relates to students and families, but less so about broader levels of understanding. Related to these issues is another concern. The reality is that as a teacher, one still has responsibilities and expectations and a positional authority related to our role. Students and families will still look to a teacher to know what is helpful to them in supporting their role as a teacher. And as someone connected to larger educational institutions and systems and the resources attached to them, it's important to be mindful of the larger social dynamics at play outside of one-on-one interactions. So cultural humility is often really helpful in keeping specific principles in mind for personal interactions and as a way to share knowledge and understanding of each other's circumstances. But it offers less guidance and structure about how to understand the challenges that might be facing refugee and immigrant students more broadly. To better understand refugees' circumstances and what is affecting their lives, it's crucially important to know what is shaping the challenges and resources available to them. For refugees, this includes how they apply for resettlement to the US and what agencies and institutions they work with upon arrival to the US. Since even different refugees from different countries often deal with similar processes and agencies upon arrival and resettlement to the US, learning about them can give you insights into the refugee experience more generally. One could also extend this understanding about the policies that affect immigration, again, like Dr. Crawford Rossi pointed out, but importantly, keeping in mind that certain policies may target different groups. To give a concrete example from refugee experience, let's consider the assistance that refugees receive upon coming to the US. Resettled refugee families receive up to a maximum of 12 months of medical and cash assistance through federal and state offices who work with local resettlement agencies. The full length of that might actually be much shorter, depending on how resettlement agencies allocate their funds and the cost of living in a particular area. During those initial months, the expectation is that families are supposed to fully integrate into the US healthcare and education and employment systems. But because the period of assistance can be short and the subsidies may not be sufficient for families and for entire families, it's been well documented that many refugees find themselves working with social welfare agencies such as food and housing assistance before the end of those 12 months. Understanding this process and which agencies work with refugees is part of an approach called structural competency. Structural because you're learning about how different policies and agencies or institutions and the relationships between them affect people's experiences. Because these policies and institutions are meant to treat people in broadly similar ways, understanding them can help us understand more generalizable aspects of experience without running the risk of stereotyping people based on where they're from. And while structural competency can be really helpful to understand these challenges and opportunities, I don't want to paint it as the solution to all the limitations of cultural competency or cultural humility. For example, it doesn't offer us much guidance about the ways in which individual students and families have interacted with the agencies they're dealing with. To try to translate this into real experience, I'll talk a little bit about my work as a teacher at Northeastern. So structural competency might help me understand the different committees and deans that affect the curriculum, class size, and out-of-class expectations that shape my experience teaching. They also help me know that I'm not the only one affected by these things and to use that to understand my colleagues' experiences. But on the other hand, it's also still important to keep in mind that other teachers' reactions may be different from mine based on the class they teach or their own professional and personal backgrounds. The reality is that I'm holding both structural and interpersonal aspects in mind when I'm talking to other teachers. Similarly, for refugees, their opportunities and challenges are shaped by laws and policies that are enacted by local agencies and government offices, all of which are important to consider. This can tell you a lot about what your students and their families will likely face without diminishing the importance of their individual backgrounds and agency. So to close, I'd like to review what we've talked about. And so we've gone over 3 ways teachers might approach working with students from a population they're not familiar with, learning about very general aspects of the country people are from, such as which languages are spoken, which religions are practiced, what food is eaten, and things like climate and weather that people might be used to, can be a helpful starting point. And because the goal is to gain competency, this approach in the shared practices of a group, this approach is called cultural competency. But while it's a helpful starting point, it should rarely be used on its own. To gain true competency can take a lifetime, and relying on superficial understanding of someone's culture can unintentionally lead to relying on stereotypes. To understand students' specific life circumstances and avoid the risk of these stereotypes, you can try to learn directly from students and their families in an approach called cultural humility. Humility because you're placing yourself as the learner and others as the expert. It can take time to build the trust necessary to use this approach, especially with refugee and immigrant populations who have had incredibly difficult experiences. But even once that trust is built, the relationship is still centered on one's role as a teacher. That includes our ties to larger institutions like the educational system. And one way to learn about the context of refugees' experiences is to understand how they're affected by the institutions and services they are likely to come into contact with. This approach is called structural competency because it focuses on understanding these institutions and agencies, as well as their relationship to one another and how they shape our experiences. For example, this can include the school system and things like language services and connections between schools and social services and healthcare. What this approach will provide is less about guidance of interpersonal interaction that one can rely on, which is where cultural humility might be a helpful complement. So I realize much of what I covered today may be intuitive or reflect approaches you're already taking. So I hope my presentation helped think about the principles underlying these approaches, their potential pitfalls, and ways that they might be used together. If people would like to reach out to me after today, I've left my email up on the screen, and I would just want to thank everyone for their patience and listening today.
Carmel, right on time, might I add. Thank you so much for that presentation, and it was great to be that you followed Emily's presentation, because it was really to dive into those methods that teachers need to employ in order to understand their students. One thing I'm often reminded of is just how little we know about growing up in other countries. And the realities that a lot of people have faced. I mean, we spoke to Maher at the very opening of this conference, and he looks like a regular guy, but he has this incredible and traumatic experience growing up in Baghdad. And as we also heard from the student of Jessica Lander, what you talk about reminds me a little bit about the former Chelsea, Massachusetts police chief who used to print out fact sheets about refugee populations and distribute them to his police force so that they would know people coming from Eritrea, this is the language they speak, predominant religions, et cetera, et cetera. But thank you so much. I think if you were to leave us with one thought based on your presentation that teachers could probably readily do, what do you think it would be?
I think the thing that I would hope that the overarching sort of message of my presentation is that these approaches really, I think, need to be used together. I think that's one of the strengths and things I appreciate about the conference that you all put on today, is that it emphasizes sort of humanizing our students through like these sort of different approaches, understanding their personal stories and their experiences and their sort of the uniqueness of their experience, while also keeping in mind that there are things that really shape those experiences upon coming to the US. And like that, these are not either or things to consider, but things that we should really think of as complementary approaches. And I see some people are asking for resources one might use in the classroom. What I'll do before I provide the slides is I will include an additional slide or two about potential resources people can use, so that that'll also be posted when the presentations are shared.